Did your family have favorites? If so, were you the favorite or someone else?
I learned a strange kind of quiet the day they came home to a house that had stopped recognizing them, a quiet with edges like a broken plate that no one wanted to admit was theirs, and I remember thinking, this is what happens when you teach a person to disappear politely. But before that quiet there was a different one, the kind you get when a mother smiles too brightly and a father avoids your eyes. The kind that settles in your chest when the golden child breezes in late and everyone laughs. As if lateness were a personality trait and not a choice, and I suppose that is where the hook belongs, right at the moment when I was told they could not afford to take both kids on a family cruise. Because apparently scarcity is a tradition in our house that always starts exactly where Ryan's wants end. My name is Emma, and if you looked at my life on paper you would see a responsible woman with a steady job, a reliable car, and a calendar that remembers appointments my parents forget, and you would not notice the receipts unless I showed them to you. Which I rarely do, because I was raised to believe that being dependable is its own reward, and yes, I know how funny that sounds to people who were not assigned the role of house Sherpa before they could legally rent a car. I moved back after Dad's minor stroke because Mom said she needed help just until things stabilized, which translated to me picking up utilities, groceries, and the repair guy who kept calling the dishwasher a valiant old soldier, while I slid my card and pretended not to taste resentment in the back of my throat. Ryan is my younger brother by 3 years, and he has the kind of charm that arrives first and offers to pay later, the kind that makes waiters upgrade his fries and old teachers remember him fondly, the kind that gets rewarded because people enjoy rewarding it. And when he stumbles, which he does with the grace of a man who knows someone will catch him, there is always a fresh start waiting, a couch, a spare key, a parent who says the word potential like it is a family heirloom that must never be appraised. He calls me Em like he invented the nickname, asks me to proofread resumes that read like fantasy novellas, and promises that this time he will stick with the job, the apartment, the girlfriend who collects candles and red flags. And every promise lands on my kitchen table like another bill addressed to occupant. When the cruise came up it slid into conversation the way expensive things slide into families that like to pretend they are a treat from the universe. Mom reading from an email with glossy photos of turquoise water and smiling couples doing coordinated snorkeling while Dad nodded and said something about how they had earned a little fun after a hard year. And I said that sounded lovely and asked what dates I should put on the calendar, not because I was fishing for an invitation, but because I wanted to plan the dog sitter and the garbage pickup and the 1,000 small tasks that keep a house from falling into chaos. And that was when Mom's smile stiffened and Dad looked at the table and Ryan cleared his throat in the way people do before they say something they believe is reasonable but know is about to bruise. They told me they could not afford to take both kids, that the package price worked for 3 passengers and not 4, that the promotions were tricky and the balcony suite was already a stretch, and the idea, which had sprung up in a moment of joy, would break if pushed too hard, and I watched them try to shape the words into something that would feel like fairness, and I helped, because I have always been helpful, nodding and offering the kind of jokes that keep a room from cracking, saying, well, of course the ship might list if we had one more sarcastic woman, and Ryan laughed, relieved, promising to bring me back something with a flamingo on it, as if souvenirs could stand in for solidarity, and I smiled so hard my jaw hummed. Later that night, I did what grown daughters do when they are told they are optional. I ran a bath too hot, opened a cheap bottle of wine I had saved for a celebration I never named, and lined up every folder from the file cabinet I keep under my bed because the cabinet in the office smells like mildew and broken promises, and I read my handwriting from all those years of being practical, the roof deposit that kept the rain out, the new water heater that stopped the morning shivers, the down payment I loaned when the bank hesitated, the contractor invoice for the kitchen where Mom bakes her Christmas pies and tells guests she knows a guy, and I felt something settle that was not bitterness, but clarity. A kind of internal eye exam where the letters stop swimming and you realize you have been squinting at your own life. I remembered the day Dad said, you know, honey, this will all be yours someday. The way men say someday like a promissory note that requires you to keep being good, keep being available, keep being grateful for the chance to audition for an inheritance that if we are honest, has always been more sentimental than practical, and I heard my own laugh from that day, soft and loyal, and I wanted to reach across time and grip my own shoulders and say, "Sweetheart, generosity without recognition is not love, it is a subsidy, and you have been funding this family like a quiet little grant program with no logo and no press release." The morning after the cruise announcement, I made pancakes because muscle memory is stubborn, and while they ate, I asked simple questions about dates and pet care and the mailbox and the thermostat settings. All the invisible scaffolding that makes a vacation possible for the people who get to go on it, and they answered happily because the story they were telling themselves required me to be my usual competent self, and I was, but not for the reasons they thought. I was taking an inventory. Not of the house, which I already knew by heart, but of the ways I could stop propping up a structure that treated me like a spare chair, and each answer they gave me felt like another light flipping on in a hallway I had walked in the dark. I kept my humor because it is a shield that looks like a smile, but I did not keep my illusions, and when Ryan made a joke about me being the captain of the homestead while they sailed the high seas, I raised my coffee mug in a toast and said that sounded perfect. Because every ship needs someone steady on shore, and he grinned because he heard flattery where I heard warning, and Mom squeezed my hand and said she knew I understood, because I always do, and I let her believe it for one more day. While I slid the thick envelope of receipts into my tote and thought, if they cannot afford both kids, maybe they are about to learn what it costs to lose the wrong one. By the time the suitcases came out of the closet and the house filled with the rustle of new resort wear and the misplaced confidence of people who think luck is a personality, I had already chosen the first small revenge I could take without raising alarms. Not out of spite, though I would forgive you for calling it that, but out of balance, which is just another word for dignity. I moved my name off a shared card they never paid, redirected a delivery account they assumed was theirs because it arrived on the porch I maintained, and tucked a key into a small velvet box that did not look like anything at all, and as the car pulled away, and the dog pressed his nose to the window, and I waved like the kind of daughter who wishes people bon voyage, I closed the door behind me and slid the bolt softly, then walked down the hall to the office that had always been more mine than anyone admitted, opened the bottom drawer, and lifted out the last document I had never used because I never needed. 2. A document Sophie once called my insurance policy, and I set it on the desk where the afternoon light made even old paper look new and thought, if they want a cruise, they can have a story to tell on deck, because when they come back, someone they counted on will be gone, and something they counted on will not belong to them anymore. The week before they left unfolded like a dress rehearsal for a show in which I played stage manager, wardrobe assistant, and understudy who would never be allowed on stage. Because while Mom practiced cheerful goodbyes in the hallway mirror and Dad compared excursion packages that promised coral reefs and steel drum sunsets, I found myself labeling pet food containers, laundering the good towels so the bathroom smelled like eucalyptus and borrowed optimism, and lining up the medication organizer that I had purchased after Dad's episode because the doctor said consistency mattered more than pride, and as I worked I listened to their excited planning with the kind of politeness that looks like agreement but is really reconnaissance, gathering the last pieces of proof I needed that in this family economy my labor had always been the invisible subsidy that made the visible luxuries possible. Ryan arrived with a duffel bag that looked like it had been rescued from a garage sale and a grin that could have qualified for tax credits, and when he hugged me he smelled like cologne samples from a department store he did not buy anything from, asking if I would water his plants, which I already did, and forward the mail that rarely contained bills in his name, and I told him I would handle it as I always had, because there is a particular pleasure in offering the same dependable answer while inside. A different plan quietly takes shape one signature at a time. I took the car for service, made sure the tires would not punish me for their neglect, programmed the thermostat to a schedule that would keep the house from sweating through the heat wave, and then sat in the driveway with the receipt on my lap, marveling at how many ways responsibility can be disguised as love until one day you hold the disguise in your hands, and it looks like a costume you never auditioned to wear, and that night, after dinner, when the house had softened into the gentle clatter of dishes, and the television murmured about a cooking competition where the judges applauded risk. I brought out a folder and asked Mom if she could sign a maintenance authorization for the home warranty plan I had set up years ago. A harmless-sounding update that would simplify claims if the air conditioning failed while they were away, and she signed with the distracted flourish of a woman already at sea, while Dad initialed where I placed tabs, and the notary stamped that Sophie's friend, provided with a neighborly smile, sat on the table like a quiet drumbeat, turning routine into record, courtesy into contract. The morning of departure brought the kind of chaos that forgives every oversight because it has a deadline, which meant I translated panic into logistics, printed boarding passes, found a missing passport in the pocket of a jacket that held old movie stubs, and a folded receipt for concert tickets I had given them for an anniversary that no one mentions because gifts are fog in this house, lovely but quickly gone. And when I loaded their luggage into the trunk, I slid my duffel alongside it, not because I planned to go to the port, but because I knew that after I drove back, I would head somewhere else entirely, somewhere where my phone could ring without being a lighthouse for other people's storms. And as we pulled away, I listened to Mom narrate the route in that sing-song way of people who need to believe they are steering even when the wheel is in someone else's hands. At the terminal, Dad squeezed my shoulder and said they would send photos every day, and I smiled wide enough to be useful, told him to enjoy every minute, to try the snorkeling even if the mask felt silly, to order dessert without the predictable lecture about sugar, and when Ryan lifted his bag and said he would FaceTime me from the ship's deck with a drink that had a little umbrella in it, I said that sounded perfect and that I would be right here making sure the house still existed when they returned, which they took as the good-natured ribbing they preferred to hear, while I took it as a promise I no longer planned to keep. And then they were swallowed by the hive of travelers, and I stood alone in the heat that rises from asphalt like a dare. I drove home listening to a playlist that Ryan had once mocked as the soundtrack of reliability, soft rock with a backbone, the kind of songs that keep you company in grocery store aisles and empty parking lots. And halfway back I turned it off because I realized I did not need comfort. I needed a clicking silence in which my own decisions would sound louder, and when I stepped into the house the dog wagged as if nothing had happened, which steadied me. And I walked straight to the office, opened the drawer where the stamped documents waited, and began the sequence I had rehearsed in my head the way other people rehearse vacation itineraries, calling the warranty company to update ownership contact, scheduling a contractor inspection on the kitchen work I had financed, and filing the lien release that did not release me so much as it resolved the ledger, moving obligations from my shoulders to the paper that had always pretended not to notice. I spent that afternoon transferring the credit accounts tied to household expenses back into my name alone, so no one could charge against my predictability, canceling the automatic deliveries that materialized like magic on the porch and then became family staples, and drafting a polite notice to the neighborhood association that future assessments should be addressed to the recorded parties of interest listed in the enclosed documents, a phrase that felt like a door locking somewhere deep in the house, and although each action was small enough to be deniable, together they felt like a spine uncurling after years of stooping, and when the sun slid down and the cicadas started their evening sermon, I took the dog for a long walk past mailboxes painted with patriotic stars, past sprinklers clicking across tidy lawns, past the house with the flag that reads "Welcome Always." And I laughed quietly because welcome has rules in this neighborhood, and I had finally learned them. That night, as the ship pulled away from its dock with my family arranged at the railing like a brochure come to life, I raised a glass of iced tea in my kitchen and made my first overt move, a kindness with teeth, emailing the contractor who had installed the cabinets that Mom loved to brag about, reminding him in friendly language that his warranty work would need to coordinate with me as the payer of record and that any future inspections should be scheduled within the week because access would change soon. And then I attached a single page that summarized the updated ownership interests and maintenance authorizations, a tidy map of what had always been true but had never been enforced. And as I pressed send, I felt a steadiness that did not require applause. The next move would be larger and it would hurt, but in that moment my small revenge was perfect because it was practical, reversible only with humility. and invisible to anyone sipping rum under a sky full of cruise ship lights, and I slept like a person who had finally put down something heavy, set an alarm for an hour before dawn, and left the suitcase by the door. The first morning without their voices in the hallway felt like a ceiling fan finally clicking into a higher speed after years of wobbling on low, because the house, freed from the performance of togetherness, stopped asking me to play the responsible daughter who laughs at the same old lines and started answering questions I had avoided out of habit. And as sunlight slid across the kitchen tiles, I opened the file bins that had traveled with me through apartments and internships and the era when I believed Goodwill kept better records than paper, laying out receipts and emails and bank statements that documented fixes no one else wanted to fund, upgrades no one else bothered to understand, and the quiet math of a woman who has been told that generosity will be remembered even as the interest compounds in someone else's name. I called Sophie because she is the kind of friend who hears the weather in your voice and asks which umbrella you need, and when I told her I was done auditioning for the role of safest choice, she did not congratulate me or warn me. She simply said she would stop by at lunch with sandwiches and her portable scanner, and that off-the-record chat we had joked about for years could finally step into daylight, which is how I found myself at the dining table labeling manila folders while the dog snored like a metronome, categorizing the life I had paid for into tidy bands of home equity, shared expenses, capital improvements, and soft costs that were not soft at all when you looked at the line items. The emergency plumber I summoned during a storm that turned the basement into a baptismal, the appliance suite I chose because the warranty outlived Ryan's average lease, the accountant I hired to untangle the charitable donations that always seemed to forget my name at tax time. Sophie, kind soul in practical shoes, read through my notes with the gently furious focus of a person who knows exactly how much politeness costs women in late fees and gallstones, and she reminded me that while morality in families tends to be graded on a curve, contracts prefer arithmetic, which meant that the lien I had filed after the roof rescue, the promissory note for the down payment bridge, and the maintenance authorizations that Mom had signed with distracted cheer formed a spine I could stand on, and if I wanted to reclaim what I had loaned, without sending a cavalry of lawyers into the living room, I could pursue the clean, boring path of enforcing repayment from the sale proceeds the next time the property changed hands, or, if I were truly done, I could sell my recorded interest to a reputable investor who specialized in fractional shares and let someone else do the tedious follow-up while I packed my books and looked for an apartment where no one thought the word chart was a love language. We ate slowly, because neither of us wanted to play the old game where urgency masquerades as virtue, and by the time the scanner had nibbled its way through a decade of paper, I felt as if I had walked out of a fog bank into a day that did not require permission. With the mechanics clarified, I turned toward the house itself, not to trash it or gloat, but to peel my life out of it with the same care I once used to tuck it in, because revenge, to be satisfying, does not need to be loud, it needs to be precise. I started in my room, packing clothing without the sad choreography of maybe someday piles, then moved to the hallway closet where my grandmother's china waited for holidays that had become performances of gratitude. And I wrapped each piece in newsprint as if I were preserving a secret rather than a dish, placing them into crates labeled with destinations I had not yet spoken aloud, and while I worked I made a list that belonged in a museum of domestic archaeology. The stand mixer I bought when Mom took up baking as therapy, the rug I hauled home after 3 price checks, the coffee machine that turned Dad's mornings from grunts into sentences, all items that had been absorbed into the fog of ours until the fog lifted and the silhouettes sharpened into mine. I scheduled a storage unit near the bay with a month-to-month lease and a gate code that did not resemble anyone's birthday, hired a 2-person crew for an early morning slot that would offend no neighbor's sense of order, and boxed my books with the kind of care that suggests religion. When I took a break in the late afternoon and sat on the back steps with a glass of water and the dog's chin on my knee, the air smelled like cut grass and distant charcoal, and I admitted to myself that I had once liked being the ballast, the dependable center that kept the ship from pitching, because steadiness looks noble when you are 19 and chasing approval like a scholarship, and even at 29 when you can afford to fix things other people forget, but there comes a year when Steadiness begins to resemble absence, the bright absence of a self you postponed, and as I watched a pair of neighborhood kids turn the cul-de-sac into a bicycle racetrack using cracked chalk, I thought about how many times I had told myself that staying was easier than leaving because leaving required a story I would have to own, and I decided the story could be simple enough to fit on a boarding pass. I was going somewhere that did not ask me to be invisible. By evening, I had drafted the messages that would set the next pieces into motion, careful and polite and utterly unyielding, beginning with the contractor whose warranty inspection I had already arranged. Then the management company that handled the neighborhood pool key fobs, asking them to deactivate the secondary card that had been issued in my name, but lived in Mom's purse, and finally the quiet email to the fractional investor Sophie recommended, attaching a summary of instruments and a copy of the recorded documents with the question framed as if we were discussing upholstery. If I wished to convey my interest, what timeline and valuation would you propose, and what would be required of me between now and closing? Before I powered down, I logged into the shared cloud drive, the one I had built to keep household records civilized, and downloaded the entire archive into a tidy, encrypted folder that would travel with me while the empty shell remaining online reminded anyone who peeked that order does not generate itself. Then I changed the primary email for the bill pay accounts I had funded for years, not to shut off the lights, not yet, but to make sure that when the lights did change, the switch would be in my hand. I fell asleep on top of the covers with the dog snoring and a duffel packed at the foot of the bed, and in the soft hour before dawn I woke to that particular calm you feel when a decision has finally chosen you back. Brewed coffee on a machine that would not live here much longer, and opened the last envelope in my file, the certified letter that could be mailed while they were still arguing over excursion times, the one that announced, without malice or drama, that effective on a specified date the recorded interest associated with my name would transfer to a new party and that any questions should be directed to their office, which meant I would no longer be the help desk for a house that wanted me grateful and quiet. I sealed it, set it beside my suitcase, and listened to the refrigerator hum like a tired choir while the sky turned pale, and I knew the next time a key turned in this door it would not be mine, which felt less like a loss than like a clock finally striking an hour I recognized. By the time their ship docked at its first port, I had already become a shadow slipping through the corridors of a house that no longer deserved its furniture, moving with a patience that only people who have lived years on someone else's schedule can perfect. The plan had grown from a sketch of self-respect into a choreography of precision, and every movement mattered. From the quiet click of drawers that had always held my things to the soft thud of boxes sealed with tape that sounded like punctuation marks at the end of long, unfinished sentences. I had learned early that when you do everything for everyone, they stop noticing you exist, so my exit would not be a scream but a silence so absolute it would echo for years. I started with the attic, where forgotten Christmas ornaments and broken promises went to retire. The insulation itched my arms, and the air felt like dusted memory, thick with the smell of cardboard and mildew. There were boxes labeled with Ryan's name, old trophies, a torn Letterman jacket, a pair of sneakers so preserved in nostalgia they might as well have been artifacts of entitlement, and for a brief moment, I hesitated. I wondered if he ever thought about how much space he occupied in every corner of this house, how even his absence seemed to demand maintenance. But then my eyes landed on another box, mine, marked college stuff, and I remembered how Mom once used it as a footstool while painting. Inside were essays, awards, and a photo of me holding a scholarship certificate that had saved them thousands, a certificate they later called a lucky break, as if effort were lottery. I placed that photo into my duffel bag, not out of sentimentality, but because it was the only proof left that I had once been seen. Each day that followed was a quiet unraveling. I moved through the house like a ghost on a mission, reclaiming the invisible threads of ownership that had tied me to it for too long. I emptied the drawers in the kitchen one by one, keeping the utensils I'd bought when the old ones rusted, the plates from the collection Mom insisted were family property, but which my debit card had actually funded, and the stainless steel pot I'd ordered online the winter Ryan flooded the sink trying to defrost shrimp. The movers came early one morning, two men with kind eyes and questions they didn't ask. They worked quickly, lifting boxes labeled storage while the dog watched from the doorway, tail still, as if he knew we were leaving one life to start another. By afternoon, the walls began to echo. The house looked wrong, too light, too hollow, like a mouth missing teeth, and for a moment I almost felt guilt, that old reflex that had always kept me compliant. But then I remembered every apology I'd made to keep peace, every weekend I'd spent fixing someone else's neglect, every time my help was treated like background noise. Guilt, I decided, was just another unpaid invoice. I left the bedroom for last, because that room had been both my sanctuary and my cage. I stripped the sheets, folded them neatly, and set them aside for donation. On the nightstand, I placed a single envelope addressed to Mom and Dad. Inside, it was not a letter of explanation or regret, but copies of the notarized documents, the lien settlements, and the ownership transfers, each stamped with official authority. At the bottom, I had written a single line in calm, even handwriting. You said you couldn't afford both kids. Turns out, you couldn't afford losing one. It wasn't cruelty. It was balance. I packed my laptop, my files, my grandmother's ring, the one Mom had said she'd hold onto for now, 15 years ago, and slipped it into my pocket. I checked every corner of the room, every socket, every drawer, ensuring that nothing of me was left to be claimed, not even a strand of hair in a brush. Then I walked into the office, logged into the utility accounts, and finalized the closures and transfers. The mortgage servicer had already confirmed the equity payout, a direct deposit scheduled into an account they didn't know existed. Even the insurance policies were redirected. The house was theirs in name only now, an empty shell built on paperwork that no longer bent to them. Before leaving, I took one last look around. The silence was thick, but it was mine this time, not the kind that stifles, but the kind that breathes. I placed the house keys on the marble counter, next to a coaster that read "Family Makes a Home," and smiled at the irony. Then I leashed the dog, locked the door from the inside, and slipped out through the side gate, leaving behind the house, the expectations, and the version of me they had designed for their convenience. The drive away was almost cinematic, the long suburban street, the maple trees arching above like a tunnel of closure, the sunlight flickering through leaves that looked too calm for the kind of storm I was leaving behind. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. People always say that's a metaphor, but for me it was strategy. Looking back is how you get caught. By the time the sun began to drop behind the horizon, I had crossed the state line. My phone vibrated once, Mom's number flashing on the screen, and then again, Ryan's name appearing below it, but I let both calls die unanswered. They would land from their cruise in 2 days, tan, relaxed, and utterly unprepared for the new kind of absence waiting at their doorstep. They would open the door to a house that no longer owed them anything, walls that remembered my silence better than their laughter. And when they found my note, I hoped they would finally understand what it costs to underestimate someone who has paid every bill without ever asking for a thank you. As night fell, I drove with the windows down, the dog's head leaning out into the wind, the hum of the tires steady like a pulse that had found its rhythm again. I wasn't running. I was simply reclaiming the version of myself that no longer existed in their story. And somewhere between the highway lights and the steady sound of air against glass, I realized that revenge wasn't the act of taking something away, it was the peace of knowing they could never take anything from me again. They stepped into a version of home that did not recognize them, because by the time the taxi pulled away and the suitcase wheels rattled across the walkway in that familiar rhythm of entitlement and relief, the house had been taught to stop answering to their names. The echoes sharper, the light colder, the air stripped of the soft clutter that once disguised how much of its comfort had come from my labor rather than their love, and I imagine the first sign must have been the absence of the coffee machine that turned Dad's mornings into sentences, followed quickly by the missing hum of my laptop in the office where bills learned to behave. And then the moment when Mom shouted for me in that sing-song tone she uses when asking for a favor dressed as a greeting and heard, for the first time, what silence sounds like when it is not sulking but sovereign. Dad found the envelope on the counter, the one addressed to both of them in my careful hand, and he did not open it immediately because people who expect good news never rush the ritual. Yet when he finally slid his thumb beneath the seal and unfolded the documents that were less a surprise than a mirror, the corners did not tremble and the letters did not blur. Because the facts had been written long before that afternoon, and all that changed was whether anyone chose to read them. I had written no apology and offered no poetry, only the tidy architecture of what had already happened, the lean reconciliations that flowed like rainwater back to the source that had paid for the roof. The recorded transfer of my interest to a party that would treat arithmetic as law rather than suggestion. The closure notices for accounts that had operated for years on the premise that reliability reproduces itself without nourishment. And a brief note, one line only, acknowledging their earlier decision with the honesty it deserved, which was not cruelty but clarity, because when you are told there is not enough room for both children on a pleasure boat funded by the person left standing on the dock, you learn very quickly that there is no virtue in making yourself smaller to fit someone else's thrift. Ryan, who had spent a lifetime interpreting consequences as plot twists that ultimately favored him, laughed first, because laughter buys time, and he asked if this was a joke or perhaps a lesson, and Mom told him not to be dramatic, and Dad said there must be some misunderstanding, and then the second envelope after the first one finished its work. The certified notice from the fractional purchaser with contact information and an appointment suggestion for a conversation about settlement. And the room rearranged itself around the truth like furniture pulled back to expose the stain everyone swore they never saw. I was not there for the scene that followed, but I have lived enough of my life inside those rooms to know how the lines would go, the bargaining wrapped in affection, the history polished in selective memory. The blame passed between hands like a serving dish no one wants to wash, and while they performed that familiar play for an audience of receipts and notarized stamps, I was on a narrow balcony 3 towns away, a glass of water sweating on the railing, the dog asleep in the shadow of a potted fern, listening to the harbor ring with a small bravado of gulls, and for the first time in years I was not waiting to be summoned, not checking a shared calendar for emergencies disguised as requests, not translating other people's bad planning into acts of devotion, and in the spacious quiet that followed I felt less triumphant than level, a word I chose carefully because revenge had been the boat that ferried me across, but what I had come for was the shore. They called, of course they called, first Mom with a voice smoothed by panic, then Dad with a tone that suggested we were colleagues who had briefly disagreed about an invoice, then Ryan with the bravado that has always mistaken volume for argument. And I listened to the messages accumulate with the slow, relentless rhythm of a tide that cannot be negotiated with, and when the emails began, long and apologetic and threaded with memories cropped to cast them as benefactors and me as the lucky recipient of their benevolence, I read them in full because dignity, for me, includes the courtesy of comprehension, and then I replied once. A concise note that thanked them for the years we had managed to make tolerable and reiterated the contact details for the party now responsible for any questions about the house. And I signed it with love because the absence of tenderness would have been an easy performance, and I am no longer auditioning. Night came with a kindness I had forgotten, the kind that does not ask you to be brave or witty or useful, only present, and I lay on the unfamiliar bed listening to the unfamiliar refrigerator hum, mindful of how quickly a life can pivot when you stop calling a wound a tradition, and I thought about the small girl I had been, the one who brought home scholarships and calendars and thanked everyone for their patience, and I told her, as if she could hear me across all those careful years, that we had done enough and could set the bags down now, and that if there were a cost for this peace, it would be paid in the coin of uncertainty I was finally willing to carry. The next morning I walked to the water and watched a charter boat nose out into the bay with a row of strangers grinning at the promise of uncomplicated joy, and I wondered, just briefly, if my family would have chosen differently had they understood the price. Then let the question drift, because answers are not the only currency that buys closure. What happens next is not the part that makes good television, because there are no door-slamming confrontations or dramatic reunions staged for a holiday table. Only a series of days in which my phone vibrates a little less and my breath finds a cadence that does not rely on other people's alarms, and in that unspectacular steadiness, the most radical truth of all begins to root, which is that ambiguity is not a cliff, but a path that curves out of sight, and a woman can walk it without narrating every step to those who trained her to wait for permission. Somewhere a house has fewer chairs and more echoes, somewhere a brother learns that charm does not refinance consequences, somewhere two parents tally up costs they once labeled love, and somewhere on a balcony that smells like salt and detergent a woman sits with a dog who has no opinion about justice and considers, with a steadiness that feels like weather settling, whether she will answer the next call, or the one after that, or none at all, and the answer changes with the light, which is not indecision but freedom.